There are two Philadelphia Eagles defensive players heading into 2024 that are far more important than they're getting credit for. We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louie DiBiase, your host. You can find my work over at Bleacher Report as well. On today's edition of Locked On Eagles, I'm going to discuss why Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Devin White are far more important to the defensive success of 2024 than they're getting credit for. Plus, the ideal best-case scenario for first- and second-year Eagles. Who could they become from Eagles history? And then, of course, First Thought continues. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. There's a lot of important Eagles on defense this year. There's Jalen Carter, who's replacing Fletcher Cox. There's Jordan Davis. Can he take the next step as a three-down pass rusher? There's Quinyon Mitchell. Can he be the future CB1? Can Cooper DeJean be that long-term Swiss Army knife? Is Nakobe Dean your green dot play caller at linebacker that's a three-down player? There's so many young pieces that have question marks, potential, but as I've said on the show before, no real consistent proven production, right? And so those are the guys that I feel like, especially after the draft process, we've really been harping on because the defense is very young. It's very predicated on the success of first and second round picks over the last 3 or 4 off seasons. But there are two veterans that, at least for 2024, and because of their age, are also potential long-term building blocks. These two players are instrumental to this team. And if they return to the elite form they once had in the NFL, it could take this defense not only to the next level long term, but especially in 2024 to the point where they might be more important this year when it comes to their responsibility and their talent versus some of the young guys. They might be more important to the success of the team than a Nakobe Dean or a Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell. And it's Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Devin White. I think we know that CGJ was one of the guys last year that the Eagles just really didn't replace his playmaking ability, his versatility, his leadership, his energy, his swag. So when the Eagles brought him back, we were like, yeah, duh. That was the missing thing from last year's defense compared to 2022. So I'm not saying we don't know the value of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, but since they drafted Cooper DeJean, myself included, Gino, and a lot of people from, Eagles media and fans alike, we've been really focusing on, hey, how do the Eagles use Cooper DeJean long-term? Is he a long-term starting outside cornerback? Is he more of the Brian Branch type that's going to play slot, that's going to play safety, that's going to play in the box? Like, he's going to be that star rover. Because of that, and he's a second-round pick, CGJ has kind of been, I don't want to say left in the weeds and not really talked about or overlooked, but the role that he's going to have this year has almost been instantly going to Cooper DeJean. And I think Cooper long-term is going to be one of those guys. You can have two players that move across the formation. That makes your defense that much more unstoppable. So I think it could be both DeJean and Chauncey if they both are here long-term. But this year, honestly, I think they're going to start off with CGJ being the one that wears a ton of hats, even more so than he did in 2022 when he mostly just played deep safety. And he was elite at doing that, so they didn't really move him around until they had to when Avant Maddox went down and Josiah Scott just wasn't good enough for the role. This year, even more than 2022, because Avant is not as reliable as he was then and continues to get injured just like he did that season, and because of the youth of the secondary, and plus you have Sidney Brown, which gives you optionality, that gives you the ability to play Reed Blankenship and Sidney Brown deep and allow CGJ to move around and do what he did in New Orleans and Detroit last year. For all of that, Chauncey's going to be someone that plays in the slot, that plays in the box, that comes downhill, that's also going to play as a deep safety as he did in Philadelphia 2 years ago when he was the league leader in interceptions for the majority of the season. That's going to be his role. That's so important for this defense. Like, he's going to be your Malcolm Jenkins this year. right? I mean, that's who he's going to be. And if he is the guy he was in 2022, that puts this defense at another level. Again, 2023, yes, the collapse was terrible, but this defense for the first 10, 11 weeks of the season, they were okay. They were good. They were top 10, top 12 in many important statistical categories, but they weren't great. They weren't elite like they were in 2022. You could say that was because the pass rush wasn't historic like it was in 2022. You could say it was because James Bradbury and Darius Slay took a step back, but I'd say also it's because they didn't have CGJ on this defense. I think he's going to be crucial to this unit, even more so than he was 2 years ago. And I think, again, they're going to want to play him as a deep safety the majority of the time when Sidney Brown comes back, and they hope that Avonte Maddox can stay healthy and or Cooper DeJean emerges in the slot, which is where they're using him right now because they want to, as Vic Fangio said in his press conference a month ago, they want to first, maybe eventually use him in a versatile way, but for now have a rookie focus on one position, and right now they're starting him off in the slot. So I think eventually, ideally, they want CGJ deep and being that ball hawk, which is what I think he does best. But early on in the year, he's going to have a lot of responsibility. So Chauncey is very important to this defense. Devin White is too. Again, the focus is on a lot of these younger players because long-term, you would hope that Nakobe Dean is the core building block of the linebacker position. You would hope that Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell and Sidney Brown, Reed Blankenship, a lot of these younger players are the building blocks of the secondary. However, for, again, 2024, I'm almost more confident that Devin White's going to be a reliable linebacker than Nakobe Dean. And Nakobe Dean, it's more of the unknown versus the comeback of Devin White. Do we trust Devin White to come back to form like he was the player of a few years ago? Or do we trust Nakobe Dean's going to do what he did at Georgia versus the NFL where we haven't seen him do much of anything? And I think Devin White can be that guy. We've seen it at least before at the NFL level, whereas we haven't seen it with Chauncey Gardner, or I should say with Nakobe Dean. And the thing is, with CGJ and Devin White, these aren't 32, 33-year-old players where, hey, they're more important to the 2024 season, but these long-term young guys are more important for the future. CGJ is only, 27 years old? Devin White is only 26. They could also be long-term pieces. I'm telling you, if we get the 2021 version of Devin White, 2020, on this Eagles defense, if we get the 2022 version of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and then those young guys take a next step, there's a lot of ifs on this defense, as we've said on the show before. But if these two especially, if these two veterans take that step and return to elite form, then this defense is going to be really good. And it's going to take the pressure off a lot of these young guys to carry the load if you have these two versatile roamers on the second and third level of the defense. So I think Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Devin White, they're two players I am fascinated to watch for the Eagles this season. But I do want to talk about a lot of those young players coming up next. What's the ideal scenario for those guys long term? What former Eagles do we hope they become? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner-take-all time in the NBA and the NHL, time for the conference finals, and soon to be the Stanley Cup and NBA finals. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers, you're going to get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, all that and more. I'm a big bettor when it comes to the NBA. I love basketball. I'm thinking I'm going to bet some money on the Dallas Mavericks over the Boston Celtics, if, of course, the Mavericks get to the finals. Minnesota won the other day. It's a 3-1 series, but still betting on Dallas for sure through FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you campus analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I was thinking about the future of the Eagles defense, right? And the ceilings, the potential of a lot of these players. Like, who could they be long term? And I think you get some comparisons, from league greats, right? Like, you hope Jalen Carter is the next Aaron Donald, right? You hope Quinyon Mitchell is the Eagles version of Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley or, the Devin Witherspoon. The list goes on. There's been so many great young cornerbacks emerging over the last few years. Trent McDuffie with the Kansas City Chiefs was a Super Bowl hero this past year against San Francisco. But I wanted to play a game where I lay out the ideal scenario, the ideal ceiling, the player, the former Eagle that I think these guys can become if they meet their true potential. Like, who could I see these guys being for the Eagles if their future pans out the way Howie Roseman envisioned it to be? And I want to start with Quinyon Mitchell because he's a guy that I talked to him at the Senior Bowl about this. We've heard him in interviews say this. We saw the behind-the-scenes draft footage with Howie Roseman talking with Quinyon about this. Quinyon Mitchell wants to be Darius Slay. Like, that's the guy he grew up emulating, trying to match his style. It makes sense, too. Both are very fast corners with really good ball skills. I think they do better playing off-zone coverage, but they can play press man as well and shadow, go hip-to-hip with some of the best receivers in football. It makes sense that Quinyon Mitchell is now going to be starting, in my opinion, opposite Darius Slay. I think ideally, Sante Samuel is one of the best Eagles corners of all time, and I think he should be a Hall of Famer. Eric Allen is finally a Hall of Famer. The Eagles have had some great corners. Lito Shepherd, Sheldon Brown, Bobby Taylor, Troy Vincent. But I do think long-term, best-case scenario for Quinyon Mitchell is he becomes the 2021-2022 version of Darius Slay. Stylistically, that makes sense. Ball skills-wise, that makes sense. Scheme-wise, it makes sense. I would say if Quinyon becomes who he's supposed to be, it was the elite form, the all-pro form of Darius Slay. And I think that's just so fitting that he's going to come into the league, and who's going to teach him the ropes? It's going to be Darius Slay. Another guy that I thought about here with this topic is another rookie. It's Cooper DeJean. And again, we've been going back and forth about what his long-term role is going to be. I think ideally, best case scenario, if Cooper DeJean reaches his ceiling in Philadelphia, he'll become a Malcolm Jenkins-like player on defense where, again, you can ask him to cover the best running back on the other team. You can ask him to cover Christian McCaffrey. You can ask him to cover George Kittle, an elite tight end. You can ask him to play in the slot and be okay covering CeeDee Lamb one-on-one. You can have him play deep safety. You can have him play linebacker in, obvious passing situations and be able to stop the run if that's what presents itself because he's a pretty good physical tackler. Cooper DeJean, long-term, in my opinion, you don't hope is an outside corner. You hope he becomes your new version of Malcolm Jenkins. Like, I think for me, that's really what I want to see him be. So I think for Quinyon Mitchell, it's Darius Slay. For Cooper DeJean, I want to see him become Malcolm Jenkins. I got a couple other guys in the secondary, though. Sidney Brown, I want Cooper DeJean to be the next Malcolm Jenkins, and I want Sidney Brown to be the next Rodney McLeod. A guy that's not going to need to have as many responsibilities as a Malcolm Jenkins, as a Cooper DeJean, even as a Quinyon Mitchell. Because you have those guys on defense, you can allow a Sidney Brown to do what he does best, and that's just fly from sideline to sideline, hit, come downhill. He is so explosive. He's like a rocket. Like, he's just shot out of a cannon. And that's kind of what Rodney McLeod was. Like, Rod, of course, too, was somebody that could come down and cover one-on-one, was very versatile. When Malcolm Jenkins left, he actually wore a lot more hats than he got credit for in 2020, in 2021. But when he had Malcolm Jenkins here, he was allowed to just kind of free flow, fly to the football. And that's what I want Sidney Brown to be, right? I think he, again, last year showed he can play in the slot and he can move across the formation as well. But I think it'd be nice if he didn't have to do that. If you've got Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, Reed Blankenship, Cooper DeJean wearing all those hats, and let Sid just be the rocket that he is and just fly and just stick offensive players. Like, I think that's what I want Sidney Brown to be, is the new version of Rodney McLeod. And then Keely Ringo, I thought about this too because he's a longer corner. He's more physical. He has good, long-range speed, but he's not as twitchy sideline to sideline, in short area explosiveness. Long-term, the ideal scenario for Keely Ringo, if he's one of your starting outside corners, how about Bobby Taylor? Like, I think that's something I would love to see, is Keely Ringo being your new Bobby Taylor. Or, hey, what about a Rasul Douglas? A faster version of Rasul Douglas that would be a little bit better in press man coverage. I think that's who I want Keely Ringo to become if he meets his potential. A Bobby Taylor or Rasul Douglas. I think if he's an outside corner and he reaches the potential the Eagles placed on him last year when they traded a future third-round pick to go get him in the 4th round, that's who I could see Keely being. A Bobby Taylor, best-case scenario. Or if he's just a really good player but not elite, maybe Azul. Maybe he's our next Rasul Douglas. A couple more here, for defense at least. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., I know the obvious one is we hope he becomes his dad, right? One of the best middle linebackers, one of the best defensive players in Eagles history. But I want to be a little more realistic with this. How about TJ Edwards? I think ideally Jeremiah Trotter Jr. can be TJ Edwards, a guy that has some athletic limitations. He's not going to be someone you want to cover an offense's best tight end or running back in the passing game. He's someone, though, that's so smart. The football IQ is there. He's a great sound tackler. He's always in the right position. He's a great leader, communicator, a green dot player that just, again, you would say on paper should not be an every down linebacker in the modern day NFL with all these just souped up offensive weapons, but yet he always finds a way and he becomes an elite player like TJ Edwards has in Philadelphia and now in Chicago. It's hard to say he should become the next Jeremiah Trotter. You would hope that's the case, but I'll say if Trotter reaches his ceiling, I think he could become a TJ Edwards. Like, that's who I'd want him to be for this defense. I've got one more for you here for defense. Not Ainias Smith. We'll get into that on offense coming up next, but how about Nolan Smith? Nolan Smith, for me, because of his size, because of the speed, the style of play, if he can be an elite pass rusher, I think he becomes Hassan Reddick. Like, that was the comparison he got coming out of the 2023 NFL draft. I think Nolan Smith, ideally, you hope becomes Hassan Reddick. There's not a lot of other comps in Eagles history of a player that's similar to Nolan Smith's style, like maybe Mamula or, I don't know, like Trent Cole doesn't really fit this bill, or Brandon Graham. Some of the best pass rushers, edge rushers in Eagles history were giant dudes, like Clyde Simmons, Reggie White, Hugh Douglas. I don't know. For me, it's maybe Mamula or Reddick. I think that's who I'd want to see Nolan Smith be, is he could be Hassan. That's his ceiling for sure. On offense, a couple guys that I would like to see pan out as certain past Eagles. Ainias Smith, who I just mentioned by accident, I think ideally he's your, again, gadget slot player that can be a good run after the catch player, clutch on third downs, a deep threat. How about Nelson Aguilar? I think Ainias Smith, he could become your 2017, 2018 version of Nelson Aguilar, where, yes, is he the number one option at receiver? No, that's Alshon Jeffrey. For Ainias Smith, it's not him. It's going to be Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. Is he your, again, because Nelson wasn't even the second go-to target. It was Alshon and Zach Ertz. He was the third guy. For the Eagles, I think Ainias Smith can be that third or fourth guy behind Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert. I don't think he has a higher ceiling than that. Like, he's not going to be your new Deshaun Jackson, right? I mean, that's, I think, a little bit ludicrous. But Ainias Smith, I think he could be a nice new version of your 2017, 2018 Nelson Aguilar, where he's one of your better deep threats. He's a gadget player. You can use in pre-snap motion. You can use in the backfield at times with reverse plays. Ainias Smith, if he can become a Nelly, I think that's a good ceiling for, comparing him to a past Eagle. One more player here for this exercise. I like this. I think this is fun. Tyler Steen. Lane Johnson gave him Brandon Brooks comparisons last year. I could see it. I think Brandon Brooks, though, is one of the best interior offensive linemen in NFL history. He's one of the best players in Eagles history, in my opinion. I would like to see Tyler Steen be, like a Todd Herremans, where he's not going to be the best offensive lineman on your team. Maybe not even the second or third best. Maybe he's your fourth or fifth behind a bunch of stars. But that's the situation right now. Tyler Steen is behind 3 stars and 1 budding star in Cam Jurgens, in my opinion. Tyler Steen, if he could just be a very, very good player for, 7 to 10 years, I could see that. I could see him being a Todd Herremans, who was really good for a long time. Maybe, Tyler Steen can be an Evan Mathis. But for me, Todd Herremans was always just so solid. But he was never the best guy. It was Jason Peters or Trey Thomas or, John Runyon. There were a lot of really good Eagles linemen back then, too. They've had a really good lineman history in the 21st century. But Harriman's just quietly was one of your most consistent players at the guard positions, played some tackle, too, had versatility. Tyler Steen, I like him to be a Todd Harriman's. Let me know what you think of those comparisons. Hit me up on Twitter at LockedOnBirds and at DiBiase LOE. Coming up next, we're going to finish things off with First Thought. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, want to let you know once again about Locked On's first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. It's time for First Thought, where I pull up a former Eagle and I just give you the first thing that comes off the top of my head. And we're going to start things off with one of the greatest Eagles of all time. And I'm frustrated that this is the first thought I have, because you could argue he's the greatest quarterback in franchise history. I'd say he's number 2 behind Nick Foles, because Nick Foles got it done. He won the Super Bowl for the Eagles. He outdueled the greatest quarterback of all time in Tom Brady, which this player could not do in 2004. Nick Foles also had a historic run in 2013, another deep run in 2018. He is a statue outside of Lincoln Financial Field. Nick Foles is the GOAT, in my opinion, at quarterback. But from a longevity standpoint, that would be Donovan McNabb. Unfortunately, GOAT is not my first thought. All of these positive traits of Donovan, that's not my first thought. My first thought is annoyed. I'm annoyed that I feel the way I do about Donovan, because we should be able to celebrate this guy. And you definitely can. He was incredible for this team for over a decade, and he carried some offenses that had very pedestrian wide receiving talent, right? Like, some of his best players were at tight end and running back, and yet this guy went to 5 NFC championships, 4 NFC titles in a row, went to a Super Bowl. But for me, because he was the way he handles things now, even after his career, the obvious jealousy and insecurity almost. Ever since he got booed from the draft, it looks like he just had this chip on his shoulder, but he didn't handle it in the way that other people do when they have a chip on their shoulder. Like, he just felt petty, and I don't think at times he was always the best teammate. I think he could have handled the Terrell Owens situation a lot better. Like, yeah, was T.O. a pain in the ass? Of course he was. T.O. started stuff everywhere he went, and you had every right to be annoyed and not want this guy in your football team. But T.O. was one of the greatest receivers of all time, and if you want that kind of talent on your team, you have to manage those personalities. And it felt like even from the start, Donovan didn't even try to do that. And I don't know, like he bashed Carson Wentz at times. He was critical of Nick Foles. He's been critical of Jalen Hurts in the past. For me, it just screams insecurity. Even if he has a point to some of this stuff, it just feels very calculated. Like, he's trying to set out a narrative about himself almost compared to these players. And unfortunately, I just have a sour taste in my mouth about Donovan McNabb. And that sucks, but I don't know. That's just the reality for me. Again, he's one of the greatest players in franchise history. His jersey is in the rafters. Like, he should be celebrated, but he just, I don't know. He's just really bugged me. He's not somebody that's easy to root for, in my opinion. All right, first thought on Jason Avant, Mr. Slot Receiver himself, wide receiver 3, the man that was always complimenting Deshaun Jackson and Jeremy Maclin. I actually met this guy at the Autism Challenge in Philadelphia last weekend. Super cool guy. Just really gave you the time of day. Super nice. Does some great work with podcasting, was a scout for the Eagles for a few years. My first thought about Jason Avant might be that he had the best hands in franchise history. Is he one of the best receivers in franchise history? Absolutely not. Is he one of the most explosive players in franchise history? No. Production-wise, is he one of the best? You look at his numbers? No. Pretty pedestrian. But look at the picture for our YouTube viewers. For our audio listeners, I pulled up the Jason Avant picture of the one-handed catch he made against Tampa Bay back in 2012 from Nick Foles. Crazy, by the way, that Nick Foles threw a ball to Jason Avant. That just feels weird that was a connection that actually happened. But that was one of the greatest catches, if not the greatest I've ever seen. And that was Jason Avant. Like, he had some mitts. That dude had just stick him for hands. I mean, it was just unbelievable. He was so reliable. In traffic, you could throw it over the middle, and you would always know that he would come down with the football, right? I mean, he was just so reliable, and he was physical. He was a great blocker. He was selfless, too. Selfless is another word that I have for Jason Avant. I'll never forget the Miracle in the New Meadowlands. There's so many great moments about that game and about Deshaun Jackson's return, right? He fumbles it, he turns back, and then goes upfield and breaks a couple tackles and, dances before he gets into the end zone. He was injured. Like, there's so many cool storylines of that play. But my favorite part of that play is Jason Avant annihilating the long snapper, who was the last guy that had a chance of getting Deshaun Jackson down. And Jason Avant hit this guy so hard that they both don't even remember the play. They both blacked out. They got knocked out, unconscious on that play because Jason Avant just threw his entire body at this guy. And I'll never forget that block. Jason Avant is one of the more underrated fan favorites of mine. And he just reminds me of my childhood because growing up, like, it was him, J-Mac, and D-Jax. Like, that was your wide receiver trio and Brent Selleck. But man, did that guy have a pair of hands. Like, he was so reliable in that way, 100%. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. We got 2 more shows for you, though, this week, so stay tuned. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Let's go, Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.